Billy Budd, the titular hero of the film, is executed near the end after accidentally killing a man who was trying to frame him for mutiny. This movie was based on a novel by Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick, and my high school advanced placement English class was assigned this book to read. One day, while openly discussing the story with my teacher, I blurted out the ending, which really ticked off our valedictorian, who hadn't read that far yet. Sorry, Katie. And rest in peace, Katie. And spoilers for the following Scooby-Doo film. Oh, I forgot to mention that Billy Budd was played by a young Terrence Stamp. Kneel before Bud!
The aliens are here. They're out for us tonight.
During an aimless night drive through a desert in the American Southwest, Shaggy takes a wrong turn through a dust storm and winds up on land owned by the federal government. There, the Mystery Machine is accosted by what appears to be an alien spaceship, causing Shaggy to lose control and crash into a cactus. Thus stranded, the gang make their way on foot to a local town where they learn that they aren't the only ones who encountered Alien Invaders.
Mind keeping it down? We're trying to get some sleep back here.
See, the gang can drive in shifts. There's no need to stop at strangers' houses in the middle of the night looking for a place to sleep. The updated Mystery Machine has airbags. I can think of a lot of times in the past where they might have come in handy. Incidentally, it's times like this that the idea that teenagers all come from wealthy families really makes sense, because most of us would see wrecking our vehicle like this as a major issue. But Fred and the rest are always like, well, nothing we can do until we find a mechanic. Meanwhile, let's check out that spooky house. Steve, Laura, and Max were employees of a monitoring station looking for signs of extraterrestrial life by scanning signals from outer space. While installing satellite dish equipment, they discovered an abandoned mine that still had a large vein of gold that had yet to be extracted. Instead of reporting their discovery to the appropriate authorities, the three of them decided to illegally mine the gold themselves.
What happened?
South dishes. The government put them up about a year ago. South means search for alien life forms.
South is clearly meant to be a stand-in for SETI, the real-life search for extraterrestrial intelligence. These were the people seen at the beginning of Independence Day who originally discovered the signal that the aliens were approaching Earth. While there are organizations with SETI in their name, the acronym itself isn't trademarked, so I wonder why the writers didn't just use it. It's not like Warner Brothers owns the property and will copyright strike their YouTube channel. To keep locals from stumbling onto their operation, the three villains devised a scheme to scare people away by faking space alien activity. They used some of the money they made from the gold smuggling to create what was essentially a Hollywood-quality film set of a spaceship interior where they would perform experiments on victims abducted by their spaceship. In reality, a disguised helicopter. In addition, they stole cattle from local ranches to further the idea that alien shenanigans were taking place. This was no doubt to play on the common trope of alien cattle mutilation, but being a Scooby film, the producers weren't about to show eviscerated cows. Instead, Steve, Laura, and Max merely sold the stolen animals to, presumably, unscrupulous ranchers or auction houses.
We hired 2 friends to help us fence off the area as government property.
The fake MPs?
Exactly.
They also hired 2 men to pretend to be Army MPs to patrol the grounds during the day to ward off any trespassers. Though you'd think government-owned grounds would already have legitimate guard stationed nearby to prevent unauthorized access. This was a bit confusing, as it's mentioned that the smugglers were the ones who placed the fencing around the area. You'd think that would have been done already by the feds. This was hardly a unique scheme for the Scooby-Doo universe, as both cattle rustling and smuggling precious metals have both shown up before, even in the early days of the franchise. Alien spaceships and creatures also appeared in many classic episodes. In fact, one episode of Scooby-Doo and Scrappy-Doo from 1980 featured a villain dressed as a space alien stealing valuable radioactive ore. As the alien abduction and gold smuggling feature so prominently in the film, while the cattle rustling is only ever mentioned in passing, it's easy to forget that Steve, Laura, and Max could be considered to be carrying out two crimes at once. However, I'm going to consider stealing cows as merely a facet of the gold smuggling, a necessary step to establish the Alien Invader cover story by fooling the residents of the town.
Lester! Kiss my grits!
The fact that the villains were able to make a profit from selling the stolen animals was incidental, and likely just to assure the audience that no harm came to the cattle. Well, at least not right away. They were being raised for a very specific purpose after all. Speaking of profit, this is another one of the more valuable Scooby villain schemes seen in the franchise. And I'm not talking about the cattle rustling.
If they'd have dug 10 more feet, they would have discovered all this gold.
I've mentioned this several times before, but gold is extremely heavy. The wheelbarrow seen here looks to be of average size, which means it could carry about 6 cubic feet of material with a maximum weight capacity of around 400 pounds. If what's in that wheelbarrow is pure gold, it would weigh over 3.5 tons. Even if it wasn't just gold, which would be more realistic as gold ore in real life seldom looks that shiny, that wheelbarrow could not support the weight seen here. Even if by some miracle it could, there's no way a person could push a wheelbarrow that heavily laden. Setting aside the physical limitations of handling gold ore in that manner, this scheme was definitely worth the hassle for the villains because just what's in that wheelbarrow alone would at the time have been worth close to $30 million, or $55 million in today's money. Sadly for Steve, Laura, and Max, gold prices at the time were at an all-time low. If this film had been set in 2024, that wheelbarrow would be holding well over $200 million worth of the precious metal.
Something to scare the locals so they don't come snooping around.
It also explains the mysterious sounds of our drilling and blasting.
The villain's pot was valuable, but it was also extremely dangerous. Mining is not exactly the safest profession. Figures vary, but worldwide, mining accounts for at least 10,000 deaths each year. In the United States alone at the time this film was produced, there were around 100 fatalities annually, and presumably involved professional miners, not 3 untrained scientists who stumbled onto an abandoned gold mine and started blasting with dynamite.
I started blasting. Bang! Bang!
It was also extremely risky for the 3 of them to be digging on federal property where they were at the bureaucratic whim of any agencies tasked with periodic inspections of the grounds. And while it may have been necessary to concoct the Alien Invader cover story to explain the sounds of drilling and blasting, this also greatly increased the odds of townsfolk placing calls to the authorities asking for an investigation. Indeed, stealing the cattle was almost a guarantee that at least state law enforcement would become involved at some point. Ranchers would likely have their cattle insured for losses, and if they made a claim for missing animals, their insurance companies would be unlikely to accept alien abduction as a suitable explanation. Whenever a Scooby villain plot exceeds multiple millions of dollars, regardless of any risks involved, I tend to nudge their score upward, considering the value of the plan worth any danger involved. However, in this situation, Steve, Laura, and Max are practically begging to get caught. It also doesn't help that aliens have already appeared numerous times in the franchise. They get a 2.5 out of 5 for their design. When ranking the outfits of latter-day Scooby villains, it's easy to fall into the trap of considering them superior to what came before due to the advancements in animation over the past 50 years. Any monster presented on screen through digitally scanned drawings and painted with computers versus those filmed on dirty, hand-drawn, inked, and painted cells will always leave a better impression on the viewer. Having said that, the creature design for the Alien Invaders is reasonably unique. Instead of the typical bug-eyed big heads of the Greys that have perpetuated pop culture over the past 40 years, Steve, Laura, and Max's outfits were more frog-like, with wrinkled skin and a stooped posture. Though I'm not sure where the art department came up with those head shapes. The producers also deserve kudos for the designs of the two actual aliens in the film, Crystal and Amber. While the former does look mostly like a typical Grey, her skin at least featured an interesting inner bubbling effect. The latter, meanwhile, looked like a raptor, which is also unique as reptilian alien creatures usually look more humanoid in appearance. The Alien Invader masks were not only detailed, but they were also very articulated, featuring moving red eyes and lips that synced with the wearer's speech. Their fingers were also cleverly designed with what appeared to be suction cup tips, reminiscent of the Martians in the 1953 film War of the Worlds. Steve, Laura, and Max also accentuated their disguises with convincing props, such as the medical examination equipment inside their spaceship set, as well as the scooters disguised as alien transport vehicles. Their main alien ship was also convincing as a very well-disguised helicopter.
Helicopter.
We bought this chopper with some of the gold money, and we dressed it up to look like a UFO.
It's amazing what a few lights and a Hollywood sound effects CD can do.
This bugs me. First, why was the alien spaceship so quiet the two times we saw it in flight? Quiet enough that Shaggy and Scooby, not to mention everyone else inside Lester's house, could easily sleep through it. The rotor blades should have drowned out any of the CD sound effects, regardless of how loud the speakers were. I live a few blocks away from a hospital, and believe me, it's obvious when one of those is flying overhead. Considering the villains work with satellite equipment, I'm guessing that's a large dish welded to the bottom of the chopper that they repurposed for their UFO facade. Setting aside if it could even carry that much weight, while I'm not a pilot or an aeronautics engineer, something tells me there's no way that vehicle could achieve lift in the first place. The rotor blades need enough space underneath them for the circulated air to disperse to achieve the propulsion to fly. That's why they're always longer than the body of the vehicle. Even when one is used for transport, the load is never wider than the rotor blades. The configuration seen here would make it physically impossible for the alien spaceship to fly. Considering the proximity to the alien monitoring station, Steve, Laura, and Max chose appropriate disguises. For superstitious townsfolk, the idea that the government research lab may have inadvertently summoned intelligence from outer space is feasible. Not to mention a mistrust of federal authorities makes the idea of secret facilities harboring extraterrestrial technology that much more believable.
If you were in that dream, it'd be a nightmare.
No one's talking to you, Serge.
Kiss my grits!
Were the alien costumes scary? This one is harder to quantify. The masks were lifelike, and the idea of being experimented on is certainly disquieting. There wasn't anything distinctive, however, on which to really pin a sense of terror. A fear of the unknown, maybe, but ridged foreheads, red eyes, giant froggy lips, and suction cup fingers just aren't enough to feel dangerous. Perhaps sharp, pointed teeth or razor-sharp talons might have been enough to bump the Alien Invader disguises to scary, but as they were, they came across more neutral than anything. Unique, but not that scary, though well articulated and expressive, earns the Alien Invaders an outfit score of 3 out of 5. I would like to take a moment to thank my new Patreon members and apologize in advance if I mispronounce any names. Nager. Thank you, Nager. Fluffing Fluffinator. Thank you, Fluffing Fluffinator. Rusty Shackelford. Thank you, Rusty Shackelford. Anna and Jinx. Thank you, Anna and Jinx. The Unconventional Ghost Man. Thank you, The Unconventional Ghost Man. Thank you to everyone helping support my channel. It absolutely means the world to me. If you'd like to help, there's a link to my Patreon page below, but please only join if you're comfortable doing so. New members get a personal thank you in the next regular video I upload after they join, as well as credits in each regular video for as long as they remain a paid member. Did Steve, Laura, and Max really give Lester an anal probe?
They stuck a bunch of wires to my head. But then...
Seems years back our boy here was kidnapped by aliens, did all kind of experiments on him and such. Tell him about it, Russ.
Alien abduction stories frequently include an element of intrusive medical examination, culminating in the classic trope of, the anal probe. Almost always played for laughs, enough so that the pilot episode of South Park revolved around the joke. This feels somewhat unusual for Scooby-Doo. Regardless, it's reasonably safe to assume that's what Lester was saying when he made this gesture, followed by the look of horror on Fred, Daphne, and Velma's faces.
But you're welcome to stay here for the night. You ladies can sleep in the back room.
Aw, 2 beds. Poor Velma.
Like, where are we?
We don't know for certain if Shaggy or Scooby were treated the same way as Lester, but we see one of the villains looming toward them holding a sinister-looking object in their hand, only for the boys to wake up later, confused and in the middle of the desert. Were they drugged by Steve, Laura, and Max? Did they merely faint out of fear like usual, or did they pass out from trauma? It's also interesting that Shaggy and Scooby woke up in the desert, far enough from town that Crystal and Amber had to drive them back. Was this an attempt to kill them? They were left without food or water, and people do die from being stranded in the outdoors.
We saw a jackalope last night. It's like a rabbit with antlers.
You are funny. I'm Crystal. Like, what's your name?
Norval.
Norval?
But like, everybody calls me Shaggy.
Crystal and Amber are space aliens in disguise, so how much time had they spent investigating Earth for them to have known that jackalopes aren't real and that Norville is an odd name? You'd think to an alien just visiting the planet, they'd be like, oh, rabbits with antlers. Okay. And that's assuming they'd know what a rabbit was as well. As for Norville, perhaps that's a really bad racial slur on her planet, and she's just horrified at how easily Shaggy blurted it out. Maybe that's why she took off at the end.
Aliens, woo!
Aliens?
You understand him?
Clear as crystal.
Okay, what the f***? Why is Shaggy surprised that Crystal can understand Scooby? Does this explain his mysterious ability to speak? Is it possible only the gang can understand their dog, but to anyone else he's just barking? Like how Hobbs appears to be a real tiger to Calvin, but a stuffed animal to others. This would go a long way toward explaining why more people don't freak out when they first hear Scooby using English. Or was he referring to Scooby's speech impediment? Which, if that was the case, that's not very cool of you, Shaggy.
We woke up to a bunch of aliens on a spaceship.
Did they experiment on you?
Lester almost gives the impression he's so obsessed with aliens, not because of how dangerous they are, but rather they filled a gap in his heart. Or a gap somewhere in his body, at any rate.
Okay, you're all set. The radiator patch will hold till you get to the city. That'll be $30.
$30? For repairing a radiator and towing the mystery machine back and forth through the desert? Crystal and Amber weren't the only ones who thought this movie was taking place in the 1960s.
I collect pressed flowers. I'm keeping it quiet, because when people think you're soft, they walk all over you.
Dude, you charged $30 for a job that would normally cost several hundred. If anyone is walking all over you, it's you.
How do you like our spaceship interior? Everyone falls for it, especially your friends.
The implication is clear that Steve, Laura, and Max had successfully kidnapped more people other than Lester. It makes sense that they'd perform their alien medical experiments on enough locals to keep them away from the area surrounding the mine. But what was the point of abducting Shaggy and Scooby? The three villains already scared them away from the gold mine, and at this point, they had no reason to think that the gang were going to stick around. In fact, if they were determined to keep these meddling kids away, instead of whipping out their anal probes, they should have paid Buck themselves to have the mystery machine towed to town and repaired. All Steve, Laura, and Max had to do was tell the gang they found their vehicle while surveying the desert for dish placement, or even that the van's radio was causing interference with their signal monitoring and the kids had to leave.
Them aliens are here to take over the world!
I was kidnapped by space aliens 10 years ago! They did all kinds of experiments on me! They've been studying us for years, finding out our weaknesses! We've got to stop them! They're gonna kill us all!
What a mess!
Don't worry. Scooby will take care of it.
Shaggy's eating off the ground again. Maybe this is the reason Crystal doesn't stick around at the end. Even if the gang were told about the aliens by Lester or anyone else, all the villains had to do was put a hold on their alien shenanigans for a few days, and the gang would eventually give up. And if they didn't, just wait and see if the kids stumble onto the mine. If that happens, well... And if you think I'm expecting too much out of Steve, Laura, and Max when it comes to how bloodthirsty they were...
Ooh, you're pretty smart, Velma. Too bad you've made your last deduction.
That's definitely murder talk. And since we're discussing tens of millions of dollars, as far as the villains are concerned, the gang aren't getting out of that cave alive. This wasn't the only time the bad guys had a chance to save their scheme.
Next time we aren't gonna be so nice. Now move out!
And take your dogs with you.
We came to see if you're all right.
Yeah, we didn't want anything to happen to you.
That we wouldn't do ourselves.
The fake MPs had Shaggy, Scooby, Crystal, and Amber alone in the middle of the desert with no witnesses nearby. The intruders were dangerously close to the entrance to the mine, and as we see later, the fake MPs didn't seem to have any qualms about physically harming anyone. Why didn't they try to kill the nosy trespassers right then and there? I mean, what was the point of them having guns if they weren't going to use them? Yes, we know it probably wouldn't have worked since Crystal and Amber were really aliens with superhuman strength, but the fake MPs didn't. And who's to say that firearms wouldn't work on them? After all, we see later that the two aliens are not immune to physical attacks.
What are they doing up there?
Who knows? Wasting government money.
Unlike us.
In real life, SETI is funded by private donations. They may get the occasional research grant from NASA like any other private entity, but otherwise, they're not wasting government money.
So, what brings you to town?
I think those South scientists were near water.
Because they had dried mud on their shoes, right?
And the only place I think would have mud is the gorge.
Steve, Laura, and Max definitely screwed up by not changing their clothes while mining the gold ore, which is just baffling. Mining is a filthy job and impossible to do without getting covered in dirt and grime. I change my clothes and shoes just to mow the yard, let alone using jackhammers to tear through tunnel walls. The bigger question is, why was it only the villains' shoes that were muddy?
Do you ever give tours?
No one's ever asked, but I'd be happy to show you around.
Great!
Oh, Max, you dumbass. You made the classic blunder of inviting the gang to where you're doing your shenanigans. But were the muddy shoes even real clues to begin with? After all, the gang already saw Max out and about running errands. Wouldn't it have made more sense at the time, after Fred and Velma noticed the mud, to ask Steve, Laura, and Max about it? If the answer they gave sounded contrived or made no sense, then maybe treat it as a clue before wandering the desert looking for a water source.
Yuck! Like I don't know why worms like this stuff.
You'd think as often as Shaggy eats food off the ground, he would be used to the taste of dirt. Steve, Laura, and Max did a reasonable job executing their scheme. They managed to hide their mining operation from the residents of the small desert town by successfully abducting inhabitants and convincing them of alien activity. They also managed to mine and sell enough gold to pay for the operation. And though they never actually managed it, their actions clearly showed that murder wasn't off the table when it came to protecting themselves. For a change, we see someone in a Scooby episode with a reasonable excuse for superhuman strength. It's difficult to say with certainty, but if that I-beam is 8 feet long, it'd likely weigh a little over 300 pounds. The three men are muscular enough that it's plausible they could still be standing with it wrapped around them like that. Steve, Laura, and Max still made plenty of mistakes, like not changing their clothes after visiting the mine, leaving easily discoverable tire tracks to the mine entrance, and, worst of all, inviting the people you were trying to scare off directly to the middle of your operation. Even going so far as having them help you pack up the materials needed to carry out your plot. Damn! Scooby was not playing around this time. If he had hit Steve with that pole, it would have crushed his chest, potentially killing him. This is one of the rare moments a member of the gang was guilty of attempted murder, though it'd likely be considered self-defense. Or would it? What would have happened if Scooby had killed Steve with the pole? In the subsequent investigation, what would the authorities be told? Laura, Max, and the MPs would be charged with the illegal mining operation at the very least, though their attempts on the lives of the gang would be harder to prove, as it would be their word against Fred and the rest. A dead Steve with a gaping hole in his chest, like that one guy in Kung Pao Enter the Fist, would be a lot more evidence towards Shaggy and Scooby's guilt. And what would be their defense? They were protecting two alien creatures from Steve's attack? The only way this would have worked was if Crystal and Amber remained on Earth to testify at Shaggy's trial. Scooby wouldn't be put on trial as he's a dog. That can actually be worse because when a dog is involved in an attack on a human, they're usually euthanized. Without the aliens remaining to corroborate the gang's version of events, while Fred, Daphne, and Velma would have told the truth, would the surviving villains have done the same? They would have been arrested and tried separately for a different set of crimes. If anything, Laura, Max, and the MPs might have used Steve's death to bargain with the gang to let them go, agreeing to bury their late conspirators' bodies somewhere deep in the cavern and not report anything other than he wandered off into the desert for some reason and was never seen again. I see Shaggy still hasn't attended any forklift or other construction equipment training classes. I'm giving Steve, Laura, and Max an operation score of 3.5 out of 5. Despite a few rookie mistakes, they still showed plenty of determination not to let anyone get in the way of carrying out their plans.
Hey, quit scaring the customers!
Shut it, Serge!
Kiss my grits!
The Alien Invaders are left with a final due score of 3 out of 5. Scooby-Doo and the Alien Invaders was sadly Mary Kay Bergman's final time voicing Daphne as she passed away in 1999 from suicide. It bothers me that they waited until near the end of the credits for her dedication. And that's my ranking of the villains from Scooby-Doo and the Alien Invaders, the third out of the 4 films that make up the Scooby-Doo Renaissance, shown here along with the ones from my previous videos. The fact that the villains from this film managed to get a better score than Ben Ravencroft is an excellent example of why this method of ranking bad guys seems to work so well. If I went purely by which Scooby villains were my favorite, Ravencroft would have easily been at the top. We're near the end of the Scooby Renaissance, and while these videos don't seem to hit the same popularity as the ones I do for the regular series, I still feel they're important enough to discuss, considering how much the 4 films of this era led to the revival of the franchise as a whole. I hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, there's a link to my Patreon below, but please only join if you're comfortable doing so. Patreon members receive credit in my videos for as long as they remain a paid member, as well as a personal shout out in the next regular video produced after they join. Speaking of Shaggy possibly pointing out Scooby's speech impediment, I had a real-life situation like that as a kid. At the time, I worked at a terrible bakery with owners that treated all the workers like garbage. They would get away with it because they only ever seemed to hire dumb teenagers or society's flotsam, in particular the mentally challenged. I worked with two of the latter named Susie and Rex. Susie was a middle-aged deaf lady who washed dishes, and Rex was just a few years older than me and did general cleanup. Susie was deaf, so her speech was difficult to follow, and, please forgive me for this, she sounded like this when she spoke. Rex, meanwhile, also had a bad speech impediment, and again, please forgive me for this, he sounded like this when he spoke. And for some reason, he always called me Joe-Hose. One day, I was in the back cleaning up, and Rex walked up to me laughing. I asked him what was so amusing, and he leaned in toward me like he was sharing this big secret and said, "Hey, Joe-Hose, Susie talk funny, don't she?" I had no idea how to respond. He was making fun of the way someone else was talking, but he had this massive issue himself. Wanting to defend Susie a little, as politely as I could be, I said to him, "Well, you know, Rex, you kind of talk a little funny too, you know." He stopped laughing immediately and glared at me. "You know, Joe-Hose, it's not nice to make fun of the way people talk." In hindsight, I shouldn't have said anything at all. He wasn't exactly all there mentally and probably didn't comprehend the amazing amount of hypocrisy he was showing. So, sorry, Rex. And rest in peace, Rex.